All right, well, welcome and thank you everybody for joining us for community engagement on climate solutions for deep decarbonization. First, I want to thank the Asia Foundation for their generous support of hosting us today. Excuse me. Global Paris country goals are far behind science-based goals. According to the UN Environment Report, the country commitments are currently 50% or 11 plus gigatons below 2030 goals. To ensure the best chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius, we must cut emissions in half by 2030, in half again by 2040, and be carbon neutral by 2050. The bottom line, we must find new ways to move climate solutions forward beyond national action. The good news, here in the US, national action is not the only pathway to Paris goals. Most key policies to drive the solutions pathway, like renewable energy and transportation policies, are governed at the state and local level, providing cities and communities the opportunity to take action and affect change. And climate solutions are now becoming affordable and accessible for everyone, with electric vehicles, home solar, green electricity products, heat pump heating technology, and much more. Local action has the potential to close the gap and move solutions forward. And all across the US and the world, cities and communities are stepping up and setting bold goals on climate. Here in the US, Hawaii and California have set goals of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. As soon as Governor Brown signs.
He signed yesterday, yeah.
Oh. And the city of Fort Collins has a goal to be 100% carbon neutral by 2030. The city of Palo Alto has already reached 100% carbon-free electricity as of 2013, and that's 100% without RECs as of last year. Seattle and Boston's goal of 100% carbon neutral by 2050. And many cities have goals of 80% by 2050, including the entire state of California. Behind these bold goals and actions are individuals and communities, leaders and community-based organizations stepping up and driving change. Today we will hear from leaders on the forefront of engaging communities and moving solutions forward. What is working? What strategies are effective and what tools can help with engagement? How can we create a just transition?
Speak up, please.
Sorry, is this not working?
You need to have it closer, yes.
Okay. So there's this amazing system in here with a room mic that's supposed to pick up everybody. So I didn't know we did this. Is this on?
Yeah.
So today we'll hear from leaders on the forefront of engaging communities and moving solutions forward. What is working? What strategies are effective and what tools can help with engagement? How can we make a just transition? We will start off with a panel highlighting examples of community members stepping up and driving and inspiring local policies and action. We'll hear the story of community efforts to pass the first state-level 100% renewable electricity goal in Hawaii. The community efforts driving one of the first US cities to achieve 100% carbon-free electricity, Palo Alto, and the national grassroots effort to engage cities on 100% renewable goals with the Sierra Club Ready for 100 campaign. Next, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe will talk about messaging. How do we talk about climate solutions to engage and motivate our communities to action? Then we will highlight some communities engaging around action. First, with Bishop Andrus, we'll talk about faith communities leading on climate, and the city of Fort Collins on efforts to engage residents on climate solutions. Then Sarita Turner will talk about equity and a just transition. How do we approach work on solutions to include, support, and benefit all communities? And finally, we will come back again to tools and talk about engaging individuals on climate solutions, both through online tools and community-based social marketing. There will be a short reception following the event, which will end at 4 o'clock until 4:30 for anyone who would like to stay and connect. A few logistics. For those of you that are joining through the live stream, we will have you muted during the event. If we have time for questions, please use the chat area to let us know if you have a question. We'll be recording the event and we'll email the link to all participants after the event. For those of you attending in person, the restrooms are right out the front door to your right. Our first panel, Community Members Driving and Inspiring Change, will be moderated by Amanda Ellis. Amanda Ellis is the Executive Director of Hawaii and Asia Pacific and Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Ms. Ellis is New Zealand's head of mission and ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva and the Prime Minister's special envoy to Francophone Africa. From 2010, she was Deputy Secretary International Development, and prior to this, she worked with the World Bank Group. Ms. Ellis serves on the advisory board of Hawaii Green Growth, the World Economic Forum Future Agenda Councils, and the Council on Foreign Relations Advisory Committee on Economic Inclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and aloha, everybody. It's people like Lisa and the amazing panelists we have today that prevent me from being a climate despondent, despite the fact that The Economist recently wrote an op-ed in August titled "The World is Losing the War Against Climate Change, Living in a Fuels Paradise." And if we look at the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are now going up again, investment on oil and gas is increasing, demand for coal is on the rise, 80,000 hectares of forest are currently burning, not here, but in Siberia of all places. Lisa had a close call with a fire in Marin County, very close to her cabin last night. We're seeing subsidies for renewables go down, and the demand for energy between 2006 and 16 in Asia was up by 40%. So all of those factors might make the average person feel despondent. And in fact, having been through the negotiations for Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals during my tenure as ambassador to the United Nations, there are still glimmers of hope on the horizon. But with the withdrawal of the world's largest emitter from the Paris Accords, it is the work that's being done at the community level that is really making a difference and stopping me throwing myself off a tall building. So I am thrilled today to, first of all, give you a little bit of background about Lisa. I heard her speak at the American Renewable Energy Institute, and she's the founder and president of Community Climate Solutions, which is a nonprofit with a mission to help cities reach climate goals through community engagement. She's also doing a very interesting pilot with us in Hawaii as part of the Hawaii Green Growth effort, where we have the mayor and the governor and the 4 county mayors all aligned behind the Sustainable Development Goals and the 100% renewable target and the 100% carbon neutral target. So her platform has been called a Fitbit for sustainability, and it's not only being piloted in Hawaii, but in some 20 cities and counties across the US. So it's very exciting to see the work that one ex-Obama organizer, having been very successful back in the day, has turned her expertise online into a tool for every one of us to be able to track our emissions and make change at an individual level. And as Lisa has already pointed out, we have representatives on our brilliant panel today who are from cities, the groundbreaking work that Bruce has done for carbon-free Palo Alto. And Bruce is one of those living examples of intersectionality. He is a lifelong environmental activist, but he's also a fine art photographer and a computer scientist. So he brings all those different lenses and ways of looking at the world. And his real focus since 2006 has been getting Palo Alto to implement cutting-edge environmental policies and keeping a close eye on all aspects of climate change in general. So he founded Carbon-Free Palo Alto in 2011 and played a critical role in the carbon-neutral electricity provision, which Lisa mentioned. So thank you for being such a pioneer, Bruce. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for 3 to 5 minutes on their initiative, and then we're going to have 2 further rounds. And if we have time for questions, we'll open it up, but we want to give them an opportunity to talk about their initiative. So Bruce, if you would like to kick off, please, and I'm going to be your timekeeper. Would you like to use the podium?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. So Carbon-Free Palo Alto is a citizens climate advocacy group. We played a significant role in getting the city of Palo Alto's municipal electric utility to become carbon neutral in 2013. We continue to work with city, regional, and state officials on decarbonization strategies revolving around beneficial electrification, replacement of fossil fuel devices with their ultra-efficient electric counterparts. To that end, we've proposed an innovative program called Be Smart that any electric utility could use to replace existing devices such as water heaters and furnaces. Our program proposes a proactive, concierge-based approach from the utility, combined with on-bill financing to operate at the scale and time span required to mitigate climate change. But let's step back and take a look at how Carbon-Free Palo Alto was able to affect positive change. Our group has its roots in a citizens volunteer Green Ribbon Task Force organized by the Palo Alto mayor back in 2006. That group issued a report and disbanded, but several of us wished to build on the momentum. We formed a small core under the Sierra Club's Cool Cities campaign and conceptualized the idea of decarbonizing the city's electric supply. We met with city staff, commissioners, and council members and held a Carbon Neutral Summit to present approaches for decarbonization. The Sierra Club eventually became an encumbrance because their model for affecting change was the traditional model that didn't fit what we were trying to do. And this is at the local level. So the National Sierra Club is doing great stuff.
He didn't know Jodie back then.
So after some soul searching, I finally decided to cut the cord and founded Carbon-Free Palo Alto in 2011. I launched a website, recruited a small group of citizens with overlapping expertise, and established a mailing list of interested parties that we could call upon when a show of support was needed. We continued our advocacy efforts, focusing on the fact that the city was already most of the way towards decarbonized electricity, and that the rate impact would probably be less than a half-cent kilowatt hour. Happily, we were rewarded in 2012 by the city electric utility announcing a plan to go carbon neutral. We helped get this through the approval process, and by 2013, the city utility could claim neutrality. Renewable energy certificates were used during a 3-year transition, but then totally phased out by 2016. Ultimately, the utility was able to source the remaining renewable energy needed by contracting for 80 megawatts of utility-scale solar projects. We were one of the first cities in the country to achieve carbon neutrality milestone. The success of Palo Alto has spurred other local activist groups into action. They decided to focus on the creation of CCEs, i.e. Community Choice Energy Authorities, on the San Francisco Peninsula. Now we have 2 newly minted CCEs, Silicon Valley Clean Energy and Peninsula Clean Energy. The City of San Jose has also joined the action, opting to establish its own CCE. Here in the Bay Area and the rest of the state, the rise of CCEs that provide low carbon electricity is an exciting and positive trend. The next step is to use that low carbon electricity to replace fossil fuel devices. That's where Be Smart comes in, and we're working hard to get this concept out to a broader audience. As I alluded to earlier, our approach has been a bit different from most other environmental groups. We identified some critical design principles and strategies that have served us well. I'll get into more detail in the follow-up, but briefly, we developed an approach that featured the following attributes: a positive approach, highly leveraged approach, an approach that involved experts and expertise in the community, analytic approach, a trusted approach, building trust with the group, and a strategic focus. In the end, decarbonization is a huge opportunity to invest in a better future. Simply put, we must replace our current infrastructure with a new infrastructure that is clean and healthy. Air pollution and respiratory illness will plummet. The economy will benefit through local jobs. We can stop the ravage of our planet for one-time use resources. The net benefits are undeniable. We can make this happen through local community activism. Let's get going. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bruce. And I love that the net benefits are undeniable. And yet, anyone have a guess at how many $1 trillion was spent on fossil fuel subsidies last year, as estimated by the IMF? $4.5 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuels. So the net benefits are undeniable, but on the other side of the ledger, there are some very smart and very greedy and very naughty people. So we need all of you to continue your hard and brilliant work. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Dawn Lippert, who is the CEO of Elemental Accelerator and Director of both Innovation and Community at Emerson Elemental. Elemental Accelerator is a startup that Dawn founded in Hawaii in 2012 with the mission of helping startups change the world one community at a time. And each year, the program funds some 12 to 15 companies up to $1 million to improve systems that impact people's lives through energy, water, agriculture, and transportation. So to date, they have awarded over $20 million to more than 60 companies that improve infrastructure that transforms communities. So it was very exciting for me coming into Hawaii and a couple of years ago, and people kept saying to me, have you met Dawn Lippert yet? Have you met Dawn Lippert yet? And so finally I contacted her and said, could you have lunch with me, please? And she very graciously agreed. But Dawn has brought a whole lot of community groups together in Hawaii. She's also the founder of Women in Renewable Energy, of which I am now a member. And it's a wonderful community that brings women together to help transform the sector. She's also done a lot of background work to help move Hawaii to the 100% renewable and carbon-free goals, in addition to the work that she's doing with Elemental Accelerator. So, Dawn, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. I think I'll just stay here. Can you guys see me okay?
Yes.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. All right, so I'll just tell you a little bit about Elemental Accelerator. So we're a nonprofit based in Honolulu. We also have an office here in San Francisco. And our mission is to fund startups that are highly scalable and really impacting the world we live in. So our belief is that entrepreneurship and through sort of the power of entrepreneurship and markets, we can most quickly and effectively scale change, along with lots of other solutions that we work on as well. So you can think of the accelerator as really two halves. One is the side that kind of looks like a typical venture capital firm that finds really promising early stage companies, and we fund them and deploy projects and help them scale, very similar to what other entities do around this area. And the other side, we're a community change organization. So we're trying to figure out like, what are the barriers for these companies. We were just talking about Sierra Club looking and do the same things, right? What are the policy barriers that are keeping companies from being able to scale? And then how do we systematically knock those down? So we have those two halves that we work on. And then on the accelerator side, how I like to explain it is that instead of optimizing for financial return, which is usually how investors look at it, we optimize for community impact. But we also care about financial return, and actually our companies are doing very well financially. And so we are trying to optimize for community impact, inclusivity of our founders and having different populations represented within our companies, while also providing market or above market returns and not necessarily concessionary capital. So we do this all through a nonprofit structure for the most part, also have a small follow-on fund, but that's kind of how the accelerator is structured. I just want to spend a moment talking about the couple pieces that we have on the agenda for today, which are around community engagement, and then also this sort of intersection of policy and the work that we're doing. So The first one on community engagement, I think this has been really an iterative process for the Accelerator, and we're a learning organization, so it changes pretty dramatically every 6 months, kind of what we're doing and how we're doing it. One of the things that we've learned and over the last couple of years have really moved out on is this idea of what we call community marketplaces. So when we're going through a selection for a group of companies, and we do this once a year, we look at about 800 companies, and we used to select about a dozen. Now this year we're going to be selecting 20 companies to fund as we scale up to new regions. And as we go through this culling process, we're selecting less than 5% of companies usually that we're looking at in the course of a year. And what we started doing is bringing in community members within that selection process. So depends, sometimes we scrub the names of companies, other times we bring a lot of community folks together with NDAs and scrub all the confidential information out of things. And we start facilitating a conversation with lots of different community groups and representatives about what the challenges are in their community, what they actually would like to see in terms of innovation deployed there. And then we fund projects based on that. So kind of how that goes for us on a cadence is that we recruit companies in February and March, they apply. And then throughout kind of May, June, we start facilitating these community conversations. And we actually do with our regulators as well. So we have one with the utility, one with the regulators. We have different ones with the community members. And we're trying to bring in both policymakers as well as the industry players, and then sort of what I would call, both sort of grass tops folks as well as grassroots folks in that selection process. And then as we continue going through that, and we do our own due diligence, that includes financial due diligence, other due diligence. We then select companies within the August-September timeframe. We'll be announcing them at the end of the month. And then the last piece of the community engagement, just to kind of give you a sense of that arc and how we've been experimenting with it, is that we bring all the companies together. In this case, in Hawaii, it'll be in about a month. And then we have open event with the community. And we actually have companies present, kind of like a pitch day that you've seen before. And then we have an interactive design session where the community community members can sit down with companies in small tables and work with them on what their project would look like. What unintended consequences might there be of the thing they're trying to do? If we're doing something really interesting and new in aviation, what kind of partners would they want to have involved there? And then after that session in October, we go through about a 3-month project design process, and our team becomes facilitators of project design as opposed to just sort of portfolio managers of companies. So that's kind of how the arc of how we've been iterating on the community design piece. And we're always really open to feedback, and if people have other models that have worked really well for them, specifically related to this innovation question, I'd love to hear them. I think one of the challenges in deploying innovation, particularly somewhere like Hawaii or any island environment or really any community, is that innovation by default means change, and change can be very challenging for communities, and it makes a lot of sense. There's usually losers on the other side of change. There's usually some kind of loss, whether it's for the incumbent, our friends with the subsidies, or whether it's for other kinds of folks. And so we're very conscious of the fact there is often loss when there's change, or there's at least fear. And so how you actually manage that process becomes really important to long-term viability solutions. And the last thing I can talk about later, but I don't want to go over my time here, is just how we then intersect with policy and some of the data-driven ways that we're deploying data visualization as intelligent policy localities, which I think for those of us who've worked in state and local government, it's actually a very different process than at the federal level in terms of data-driven decision-making. And so we've started experimenting with different ways to bring in data into that conversation, and would love to talk more about that with you folks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dawn. Now to move to Jodie, here we've had city, state, and now moving to the national approach of the Sierra Club, and Bruce gave you a great plug before. That Jodie leads the 100 Cities program, and she's now up to 82, I heard today, which is very exciting. And obviously we're very excited that Hawaii and California are now 2 states who are involved in this process too. And California, being the 5th largest economy in the world, is really going to shift the dial. So hopefully that is going to open the floodgates for you. So the Ready for 100 campaign is really spearing this equitable transition to 100% clear renewable energy. And Jodie has been working in this field for over a decade joined Sierra Club in 2011 after winning a campaign at Greenpeace International that helped Facebook unfriend coal and move to a commitment to 100% renewable energy. She's also had experience with Rainforest Action Network and Good Guide. And after Jodie has given her introduction, we're going to move to key strategies from each of the group before opening up for discussion.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists and appreciate the invitation. So I just want to start by saying that the action that we need globally is most definitely being led locally. When we started the Ready for 100 campaign in January of 2016, as the ink was drying on the Paris Climate Agreement, we knew that even with a climate-friendly federal government or administration at least, cities would need to lead the transition to a climate-safe and clean energy-powered economy. We didn't know it would be the only way that we could move to a clean energy powered economy at the time, but we were in the right place at the right time. And you know, for those of you that are familiar with the Sierra Club, it's a grassroots organization. It's over 125 years old. We have 62 chapters around the country and 3 million members and supporters. And so really see our role as facilitating their engagement on the issue of climate and clean energy. And we built the campaign to, I thought maybe, no worries. We really built the campaign to mobilize, to engage and mobilize those people at the local level so that they could lead in demonstrating their demand for 100% renewable energy. When we started the campaign, it was with a goal to make 100% renewable the new normal, to get out of a spiral of incremental policymaking or constantly working on defense, and really to set a bold and inspiring vision for where we not only needed to go, but where a majority of Americans want to go. And so we are now, you know, we now have a movement of students and community members and faith leaders and businesses and mayors all across the country who are working on bringing about this vision at the local level, and collectively are really raising the bar and creating a new mantle of leadership for climate action across the country, and despite inaction or even backwards action at the federal level. The transition to renewable energy is appealing, not just because of the climate crisis, because it represents also an opportunity to address a lot of other top of mind issues, especially for communities who are wrestling with high energy costs or high pollution rates or job losses. And so really the emphasis that we've made in our organizing is that each community decides for itself why and how they move to 100% renewable energy. And that's been, I think, a key ingredient of our success, which I'll talk about again. We, like I said earlier, I don't think realized just how explosive the growth of this campaign would be in the aftermath of the November 2016 election. We had launched the campaign in about 10 communities in November of 2016, and by inauguration in January of 2017, we had campaigns active in over 170 cities and towns across the United States. So we scrambled to provide support to that grassroots, that wave of grassroots engagement. And my team is a pretty small national team. Fellow Sierra Clubber in the midst here, and a former one to my left. Our team is a pretty small national team. We provide wholesale support through training, through organizing toolkits, through amplification, communications, and access to the infrastructure of the organization, but really operating in a way that allows 1,000 flowers to bloom, so that anyone, anywhere can be part of this movement, can be part of this campaign, and can be supported in their leadership. We call this a leaderful movement in the Ready for 100 campaign, and really allowing communities to speak for themselves when it comes to their motivations and their strategies for achieving 100% renewable energy. And as Amanda said, today 82 cities and towns across the US have made a commitment to 100% renewable. Often the timeline varies anywhere from 2020 to 2045, varying levels of ambition, often depending upon the regulatory environment and circumstances and projected ease of implementing their commitments. But these commitments have been more than symbolic. So I often get asked, okay, well, pledges are great and they're important in demonstrating bold leadership and political will. But of course, we, as Amanda outlined at the beginning in her very uplifting overview at the beginning of the panel, we need real and tangible progress and emissions reductions. And at the local level, for a whole host of reasons, we need clean energy, clean air, clean water, and renewable energy holds an answer to a lot of those issues that people are confronting at the community level. So we have seen tremendous and inspiring and real and measurable progress, and we are catching up with our ways of really capturing what is going on. As you might imagine, with hundreds of communities working on this, we're challenged to even know what all of them are doing to implement on these goals, but we have done some measurements to look at what is the potential of city level action to help close the what we've been calling the Paris gap, or the US ability to meet its commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. And indeed, cities have a very considerable role to play in reducing emissions. When Trump announced withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, an immediate and swift response came from mayors all across the country. We worked with a team of bipartisan co-chairs on an initiative called Mayors for 100% Clean Energy, and they successfully passed a resolution at the US Conference of Mayors that July, the largest nonpartisan organization of mayors in the country, to passing a resolution in support of 100% renewable energy. And if all of those cities, the mayors, those cities that represent those cities, were to implement on that commitment, on that resolution, it would represent 42% of US electricity use. So we're talking about a significant impact, not to mention that cities represent 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can do it in cities, not only can we make significant progress at the local level, but we can influence state and even federal decision making. And maybe I'll leave it there. I have lots of examples of the way in which we're seeing this, the local to state level kind of theory of change proven out in some of the places we've been working, and seeing the influence of these city commitments on utility decisions, on regulatory proceedings, and ultimately on state policies like our great state of California, which committed to 100% renewable energy this week.
Woohoo! Well, why don't you pass the microphone to Bruce? And I'd like, given that we are running a little tighter on time than expected, because you're all brilliant and we could be here for hours and hours listening to you. Bruce, if you could give just your top 2 strategies, if you were to advise those in the room who are interested in replicating what you were able to do, what would be the top 2 strategies? And I'm going to ask Dawn and then Jodie to do the same thing.
Sure. So our approach is we really focus on a positive approach that relies upon analysis and identifying the barriers to success. We institute table pounding and negative criticism in general, but we don't hold back for advocating for different approaches from the status quo. And that's
those would be your 2 big takeaways.
And the other one is a highly leveraged approach. We really focus on opportunities that have the most leverage. So the electricity piece actually resulted in a 20% reduction in the carbon footprint of Palo Alto, and no one had to do anything different. And in fact, the bills did not go up. So, I think focusing on highly leveraged opportunities is extremely important.
And might I call that a low-hanging fruit, or would you differentiate that in terms of a highly leveraged opportunity?
There's a lot of low hanging fruit that's not very highly leveraged.
Leveraged. Great
So-
point. Excellent, thank you. So Dawn next, and then we'll finish with Jodie, so she has time to have 2 out of her many examples.
All right, I'll give 2. The 2 I'll say is being data-driven and being pragmatic. So in the first one, on the data-driven piece, I think what Jodie's talking about with electricity is really critical. What you see in Hawaii, actually, because we committed to 100% a few years ago, and actually, if you peel back the numbers, the change in our electricity, which has gone from about 8% renewable energy in 2008 to almost 30% renewable energy today, that's actually been market-driven, not necessarily policy-driven. The policies help, it's been terrific. The market is totally upside down in Hawaii, where fossil fuels are much more expensive than renewables, and so if you're going lowest cost, you're essentially putting more and more renewables on the grid, which is important. The policy piece is always very important, but the devil's in the details also with how you're implementing the policy piece. So what we like to talk about is sort of goals, but then what's coming right behind the goals. And the other piece that as we implemented more and more clean energy, just last year, our transportation emissions surpassed our electricity emissions in Hawaii. And you see that same trend now in California. And so I think the other piece is to be, if you're being data driven, is to be really, really clear about where the emissions are coming from. Because in Hawaii, we also have a 100% renewable transportation goal that was passed by the mayors in December of last year. It is an unfunded mandate, and the market conditions that I described in electricity do not apply to transportation. It is not necessarily, it's certainly not wholesale cheaper to go to low carbon in transportation right now with the solutions that we have. On an individual basis, and EV here or there, it often is, but as a whole system transformation, it absolutely is not. So there have to be funding mechanisms, whether it's through carbon tax or other serious funding mechanisms to address emissions in transportation. The second one, just briefly, is being sort of pragmatic and partnership based. And I think this depends on sort of this chair you sit in, but from our perspective, we operate as what we like to call sort of a neutral town square. So we work with the biggest emitters in the business, oil companies, the really big energy companies out of Asia. And our philosophy is that we want to be in all of those rooms. And be working with startups that are bringing real value to those kinds of partners and bringing cleaner energy. So again, I think it depends like which chair you sit in, but being really clear about what your philosophy is and then like going all in on it has been important for us. So we don't see ourselves necessarily as advocates, but much more as bringing solutions and working in partnership with a bunch of the folks that are on the other side of the table.
Great. Well, number one, since this is a community engagement panel, I will say that one strategy that has worked really well has been just community engagement, not just in the organizing to build demand for the goals, but we have been pretty bullish with the cities that we work with that community engagement also needs to be a part of the planning and implementation process. And what that allows for is for communities to have a say in what there's many roads, many paths to Rome when it comes to a city really developing a detailed and technical roadmap for how they're going to achieve their 100% renewable energy goal. And key to that planning process is not just having smart experts in the room who can do the modeling and tell you, what it's going to cost, but also having engagement of the greater community to determine what are the values underpinning that transition and where do those investments get made, and ensuring that the transition to 100% is not just swift, but also equitable, that it addresses pollution and it addresses cost and it addresses those issues for the communities, the local communities that are most burdened. So we've been, just a quick example in Atlanta where the city of Atlanta committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2035 and then engaged in a 12-month planning process where we worked with the city to ensure that all quadrants of the city were engaged and asked what they wanted to see in a vision of 100% Atlanta. And they did a very thorough job of both tapping into the neighborhood associations and hosting 6 different stakeholder town hall style meetings where they got a tremendous amount of input in addition to an online survey for people who couldn't turn out to physical events. So the community engagement was key, and it dramatically, I would say, shaped and directed the resulting plan, which City Council is due to vote on later this month. My second strategy is just what I referenced before, which is really the influence of building statewide networks of local actors. So both on the grassroots, on the community side, having community groups that are advocating for 100%, working with and speaking with each other across a given utility service territory or across a given state has built power across a network of activists and has enabled them not only to share best practices and learn from each other, learn what's working, but also build their power across a greater geography and ultimately have a greater impact on utility decision making. And the same goes for the cities. So the cities that are committed to the goal, working together and cooperating across a utility service territory gives them more leverage with an investor-owned utility since they don't always control 100% of the electricity or have jurisdiction to shift 100% of the electricity that they're using within their cities.
Great. Fantastic tips there, and we do have time for any engagement from the audience. Is there a question that anyone wants to ask? After that, let me bring you the mic. If you could identify yourself and ask the question.
I'm Nancy Grove. I'm a board member at Actera in Palo Alto and involved in the church's effort to roll out the climate tracker you're hearing a bit about. My question is for Jodie and Dawn, and it really has to do with this whole concept of community engagement and getting all the voices at the table. Maybe I've had a limited experience, but my experience has been you go to charrettes around community planning, go to community workshops and design events around redesigning the climate action plan, something like that. And my experience has been that it's basically the converted that show up with these things. And so if you're really trying to understand the unintended consequences, and you're really trying to be a convener and make sure that all the issues are out there so everybody can hear them, how do you get to the naysayers?
Who's first, maybe?
I can start. Well, I think it's both getting to the naysayers and getting to underrepresented groups. I think they're equally important because the other thing that you don't see at those meetings for the most part are people who are 2 or 3 jobs and struggling to put food on the table. So I think that in our experience has been one of the most important things about how we engage. And I have a couple thoughts. One is that I think the most important ingredient to this is the makeup actually of our own team and ensuring that there are people on our team who come from a diverse set of communities. So that's, I think, been really important to us because they're actually reaching into, and then having sort of those networks, they're reaching into their own networks, which are not people necessarily wake up thinking about climate change or other kinds of issues. So I think that's been really key for us because Hawaii is this very small community. So and in the Bay Area where we're working, that's also a tight-knit community. So you're actually trying to figure out how to get into social networks that are sort of beyond those initial folks. And I think I think this is a huge problem in general with community engagement. So I do not want to say that we've solved this. I think we're still learning, and I think the organizations that are doing this are absolutely still learning. But that's one way that I've seen has been really successful. The other thought that I have is around the data piece of it is actually, so we released a study a couple months ago called Transcending Oil, which is transcendingoil.com if you want to check it out, and it has a data visualization. So we basically took this 100-something page report, which is really detailed with many technical appendices that go on for many, many more pages, and then and then we worked with Pudding, which is a data visualization sort of awesome organization who you guys should absolutely follow if you don't, to put it in a format that was like really easy, understandable, and like, oh, how many hours a day go toward paying my electricity bill, and like, this is how much money I make per hour, how much does that make it really understandable to folks. So those are a couple of thoughts I have about that, but I think we're absolutely still learning. The third tiny piece is that the best way into this, and we don't do this very well or very much, but our partners at Blue Planet Foundation that these guys work with a lot do, is they go in through the schools. And the schools democratize everything because it's every single population. And then when students then engage parents and you're kind of coming up in through the schools, that's been an incredibly effective way to spread the message. And that's actually was a key strategy to getting the 100% renewable energy passed in Hawaii.
I'll just be really brief since in the interest of time. The one thing I would say is that I alluded to this at the beginning, but we start from an approach of really understanding that the community that we're working in. And usually these campaigns are started by, members of those communities. And so they have a landscape, and a map of what is important, what are the issues locally. I think the value of that is that we've seen cities ranging from Georgetown, Texas, and Avita Springs, Louisiana, in the heart of oil country and very conservative areas, making, pledges to go 100% renewable. And that's because they have focused on the economic gains of doing so. And we have not, when we've worked with those cities, emphasized or led with climate change. And so I think having a flexible framework when you're working at the local level that is respectful of and acknowledging of the local priorities, whether, no matter what community you're working in, letting people speak for themselves and determine, what it is that motivates them, and then leveraging the tools that we have to support them in their pursuit.
Lisa has just asked me to elaborate a little on Dawn's last point, which was the work that the Blue Planet Foundation did with the schools. And in 2013, I think it was, when the 100% renewable energy target was proposed in Hawaii, the governor at the time said it was magical Harry Potter thinking. And so the Blue Planet Foundation came up with an idea of asking school children to take part in a drawing competition. And it was the world that they wanted to see by 2040, I think. And then they got all of those beautiful pictures bound in a hard copy book. And they took those school children along to meet the legislators. And miraculously, just a couple of years later, the 100% renewable energy target passed. So I think that's a really interesting strategy. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a couple of layers of depth to it. And that piece is really key around sort of drawing the future they want to see. The other piece that's been really interesting is for a few years now, they've been running something called the Student Energy Summit. And it brings together students from across the state, so all the different islands together, and it's experimental based learning to learn about sort of EVs and wind and solar, all that stuff, and also policy. So they're doing many other things as well, sort of going into the schools, but trying to this sort of multi-layered education that at one level is sort of really basic engagement, and then actually really trying to train students in what this stuff means, and they take that home to their parents, and organizing from that level has been very effective.
Brilliant panel. We have 1 minute left to wrap up, so I hope I'm going to do you justice. Importance of having targets and vision, making sure that you're clear on your philosophical approach, but that it's a flexible framework for local priorities. It's pragmatic and partnership-based, taking a positive approach rather than bashing, and making sure that you have good data analysis of the barriers, a data-driven approach, remembering that the devil is in the detail, and that if you want to succeed, you always need to have community engagement built in, collaborative networks across boundaries to learn and leverage power, and the multi-layered approach through schools. So some fantastic takeaways there. Thank you all very much indeed. Brilliant panel, and they say that first an idea is unthinkable, then it's impossible, and then it becomes business as usual. Let's hope this becomes business as usual.
Thank you, Amanda, and everyone on the panel. Amanda, that was extremely impressive the way you wrapped everything up. Well done. Thank you. So Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is joining us from Austin, Texas. She is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. She is also a remarkable communicator. In 2014, she was recognized by Time magazine as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world, and by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 global thinkers. Her work was featured on the Emmy Award-winning documentary series, The Years of Living Dangerously, and she won the American Geophysical Union's Award for Climate Communication. In 2016, she was named to Politico 50 list of Thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics, while in 2017 she was named one of Fortune's World's Greatest Leaders. She is a lead author for the U.S. National Climate Assessments and has served on the panels for the National Academy of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and many other professional organizations devoted to understanding and communicating on climate change. Katharine is currently a professor and directs the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. She has a BSc in physics from the University of Toronto and an MS and PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. Katharine is going to talk about messaging, communicating on climate. How do we talk about climate to engage our communities? And I will hand it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So just to check, you can see me and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. The reason why I do so much communication is actually because I don't live in Austin. So interestingly, Austin is kind of like, you know, the blue bubble in Texas. And if you live in Austin, you would have friends and neighbors and colleagues and even people you knew from church or from whatever group you were part of who agreed with you on climate change. But if you live anywhere else in the state, especially if you live in Lubbock, which is the second most conservative city in the entire country after Provo, Utah, then almost everybody you meet here doesn't think that climate is changing due to human activities. And what you do is a few rungs lower down the ladder than maybe astrology or something like that. So because of where I live, yes, because of where I live is actually why I started to get so much into talking to people about climate change, because people here are actually very curious and they had a lot of questions. And so when they started asking me these questions, I was like, well, I have to try to find answers. So what I want to share with you today, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion afterwards, is what I've learned through more than 10 years now of talking to people about a changing climate. So let me share my screen with you here. Okay, just a second here. All right. I'm going to have to put this into slideshow mode. There we go. The biggest thing I've learned is that bombarding people with more sciencey facts is not what makes the biggest difference. Now, it's really hard when we see people say something like this. For everybody who thinks it's warming, I can find someone who says it isn't. Or even worse, alarmist theories originate with scientists who operate outside the scientific method. So we often think if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, wouldn't they? And this cartoon comes from one of our global weirding videos where I talk about this in more detail. But the idea that more information will change minds is based on the kind of conception of a blank slate, that if we don't have the right opinions about something, then if we just write the correct information on people's blank slates, they'll change their minds, right? Why I love the social science is because you can test things like this. This is Dan Kahan, who published a paper now 5 years ago. He actually just visited us right here this past week. He published a paper 5 years ago where he tested this. He said, people claim that the public don't know enough about science. So we have to work really hard on science literacy in order to get people on board with climate change. Is that true? We conducted a study to test for this and we found no support. In fact, people who were most literate were not most concerned, they were most polarized. And when Dan was here last week, he presented a newer study that they just did last year that showed that people who were better at quantitative reasoning, so people who could understand data more intuitively and work with it, they were actually better at cherry picking the pieces out of the data that they needed to support their pre-existing beliefs. So just because we're literate, just because we're better at understanding data and numbers and science doesn't make us automatically more accepting of climate change. It makes us more able to pick the information we need to justify the position that we have, which is kind of scary. So we are not blank slates. And that is why just giving people more information is not necessarily going to change their minds. Although, of course, giving people information is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But if that's what we're counting on to change minds, that's where the problem comes in. Because the reality is people don't really have a problem with the basic science. I mean, often people don't realize that our climate models are based on thermodynamics and nonlinear fluid dynamics, the same science that powers our fridges and our stoves and our airplanes. But they don't really have a problem with that. There's not a lot of websites that say that refrigerators aren't real or that airplanes don't fly. There probably is at least one, but not a lot of them. So this is John Evans, who did another study. He's another social scientist, and he found that people's opinions are not rooted in the level of education they have. They're not rooted in where they go to church. They're rooted in where they fall on the political spectrum. And this is borne out by several others. This is a guy from the National Association of Evangelicals, an organization I work with quite a bit. And he absolutely hits the nail on the head. He said, people oppose action politically. Why? Because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. And Senator Inhofe is well known for writing a book on how climate change is the greatest hoax ever perpetuated. But he said this 5 years ago. He said, do you realize I was on your side till I first heard about this? Till when? Till I found out how much it would cost. People do really have a problem with what they perceive to be the solutions. They do. What do they perceive to be the solutions? Taxation, giving the government more power, having to replace their religion with an earth-worshiping religion. This is genuinely what people see the solutions to be. So let's just recap. Higher taxes, increased government control, loss of personal liberties, and forced conversion to a false religion. You may think I'm exaggerating. I am not. This is what actually comes down to, or this is what the solutions are presented as. And here's something very interesting. These solutions are profoundly un-American. What was the Revolutionary War fought over? It was fought over taxation, government control, a big government far away imposing its will on people and robbing them of their personal liberties. And it was also, the United States itself was founded on the basis of freedom of religion. Many, not all, but many of the original people who moved to the United States, especially in Massachusetts, came in order to practice freedom of religion. So interestingly, and I don't think totally by accident either, solutions to climate change are often characterized or framed by people who don't want them as being opposed to one or more fundamental core American values that have been woven into the psyche of American people for hundreds of years. So at this point you might say, okay, are we done? Like, is this hopeless? Can we do anything about this? We absolutely can, because of one word which I hope you noticed here. People really do have a problem with what they perceive to be the solutions, and the emphasis, of course, is on the word perceive, right? Because we know that loss of personal liberty and terrible taxation and converting to a false religion are not the actual solutions to climate change, right? But today, let me actually just read you something that my colleague texted to me just half an hour ago. As you may know, I'm in the political science department, and I love my colleagues here. I learn so much from them. They follow politics very closely, of course, because that's what they study. So one of my colleagues just got the survey that the Republican Party sent out to all of its registered voters. And it's a survey, yes, no, or no opinion. Here's the question that that survey asked about climate change. Ready? You'll see exactly what I mean when I read you this question. Unfortunately, it seems to be upside down on my phone. So let's see if I can rotate my phone. Okay, here we go. Here's the question, listen. The Democrats' fixation on climate change, in quotes, climate change, has led to costly regulations that are negatively affecting our nation's economy across the board. Do you think climate change is a major threat to our nation? What red-blooded human is going to say yes to that? You see what I mean? They framed the solutions to climate change. They immediately connected the science to the solutions, number one, and then they framed the solutions as punitive and as destroying the economy. And then they asked, do you agree with this? Of course you don't agree with it. The solutions to climate change are being deliberately framed as something that nobody would want. And this is where you can make a difference. Because the reality is that if you look at the solutions to climate change, what is more American than energy independence and a healthy economy and jobs and global leadership? Seriously, what is more American than that? And here's the interesting thing. When you poll people and you ask them things, this is the Yale Climate Opinion polls, and they poll people by congressional district and by county. If you want to find them online, you can just Google Yale Climate Opinion. They'll pop right up. They ask people, do you think global warming is mostly caused by humans? And anything that is blue is less than 50%. And so we look at this map and we say, science literacy, we need more information on the science to change people's minds. But then let me show you a few more maps. So this is, do you agree with the science? And you can see the country's about, 50-50. Do you support requiring utilities to produce their energy from renewable sources? The whole country's orange. But isn't this a solution? Yes, this is a solution. So this is not what people take or perceive to be the solutions. This is a real solution. And guess what? Everybody agrees with a real solution. Now, they said, do you support setting strict CO2 limits on power plants? Why would you support setting CO2 limits if you don't think it's causing warming? I don't care. I don't care at all, because as long as we do it, doesn't matter, does it? Everybody supports this. And then, do you support funding research into renewable energy? Yes, everybody does. See, so people don't actually have a problem with the real solutions. They have a problem with what they are being told, and in some cases, sadly, being lied to about what the solutions are. So what does this have to do with talking about climate solutions? Everything, right? Yes. The way I do this, the way I talk, has a lot to do with solutions. I first of all identify where I have something in common with people. Then we can do some explaining if we need to at that point. But most importantly, and if I had to pick one step, I'd probably just pick the last step, we need to talk about ways that we can work together to fix this problem that are compatible with our values, that are good for our community, they're good for the economy, they're good for our family, they're good for national security, they're good for American exceptionalism and global leadership, they're good for whatever it is that the person or the people that we're talking with value. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples so you know what I'm talking about here, and then we can open this up for questions or discussion. What do I mean by bonding? People often assume, and I just talked with somebody this morning, they often assume that the only way we can bond with people is over issues of faith, because that's often what I do. But so when I was talking to this guy this morning, he said, well, I'm gonna be totally honest with you. I've only been to church twice in my life. I didn't ask why, but I'm gonna guess baptism and marriage, maybe. He said, well, how can I bond with people? And I said, well, only about 20% of the time when I'm talking to people do I use faith. I said the other 80% of the time I use other things. Like what? Like things that I enjoy doing. Are you a birder? Are you a hiker? Are you a skier? Are you somebody who enjoys the water? Are you a parent? Are you passionate about your kids? Do you live in a certain place like Texas? Do you care about having a healthy local economy and jobs and growth? Do you care about having low energy prices? Here in Texas, wind and solar energy is cheaper than natural gas, which is awesome. Who doesn't care about that? Everybody loves saving money. I'm not a Rotarian, but my favorite group to talk to now is the Rotarians, because the first time I went to speak to them, I saw this giant banner as I walked in the door. And I looked at this banner and I thought, this is climate change. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? No. Would it build goodwill and better friendships to do something about it? Yes, it absolutely would. And would it be beneficial to all concerned? Well, fixing it is. Yes. Not fixing it isn't. So I rearranged my whole presentation and I presented the 4-way test of climate change. And afterwards, I still remember this man came up to me, looking totally bemused, like he couldn't believe it. He's like, I wasn't sure about this whole global warming thing, but it passed the 4-way test. So I had put it within his value structure, and not, sort of accidentally, like I just seen this banner. I was like, oh, this looks perfect. But Rotarians take this very seriously. And I had put climate change in his value structure so we could immediately connect over issues of it being true, it being fair, and it being beneficial. And then it's not just about Christianity. Every major world religion has values of stewardship or care for creation or for nature, and values of caring for people who are less fortunate than us. And so with over 80% of people in the world belonging to one or more faith traditions, then yes, this is an important way that we can connect, but it is not the only way, because the bottom line is every single human on the planet needs air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat, wants a safe place to live, a healthy economy to raise their kids. We're not designed to float around in space. We need our home. It is our home that we share with 7.5 billion people, but we have that in common. We can't survive without it. So then we can explain, and explaining, it's optional. I do a lot of explaining because I'm a scientist, but the amount that I explain has gone down and down and down over time. But people often have questions. They want to know, why does this matter? It matters because sea level is rising. Hurricanes like Florence are getting stronger. They're affecting us in the places where we live. Winters are getting warmer. Invasive species are moving northward. Beetles are eating millions of acres of forest. Wildfires out west are getting a lot bigger. Up in the Arctic, what used to be permanently frozen ground is thawing and crumbling, putting 200 Native American villages at imminent risk. Wherever we live, whether we worry about air pollution, whether we worry about native species, whether we're concerned about fall colors, whether we're looking at flooding of urban neighborhoods, whether we're concerned about agriculture, we can explain how these changes that we are already seeing today, they're not future anymore, they're here today, these changes are affecting us personally in the places where we live. And one of the biggest ways it's doing so, and this is why our video series on YouTube is called Global Weirding, not global warming, global weirding, is because it's changing the frequency or the intensity of a lot of our weather and climate disasters. We always have a chance of getting these disasters naturally, but in some cases they're getting more frequent, and in other cases like hurricanes, they're not more frequent, but they're getting a lot stronger and they're impacting us more. Things are just getting weird, and most people can feel that. They've sensed that, they've lived it. But lastly, and I think honestly most importantly, we have to talk solutions. And this is something that I'm not an expert in. I don't do solutions, I diagnose the problem. Climate scientists have been diagnosing the heck out of climate change for 200 years. You can make that a bumper sticker. That's what we do. We diagnose, and then we sit back and we fold our hands and we say, what do you do about it? Well, that's not my job. I don't know, talk to somebody else. But I've come to realize that if we're going to tell people there's a problem, we have to at least begin the conversation on solutions. I'm not an expert, but I can point them to people like you who do have a lot more information on the solutions. So what type of solutions do I talk about? Well, I was talking to a housing conference that was very concerned. It was people who own, thousands of rental homes across the country, or reinsurance companies, not insurance, but reinsurance. They were really concerned about coastal flooding. So I talked about how coastal property values have already fallen 7% in the United States, but I talked about innovative solutions like this village in the Netherlands, which is now building floating homes. And they have floating homes in Portland, Oregon. They have floating homes in a couple of other places around the world. And it was really awesome because after that housing conference, this woman came up to me and she said, my mother lives in those apartments that overlook the village. I was like, send me a picture. I want more pictures. When I'm talking to farmers here in West Texas, where water is always at a premium, I talk about how replacing old 1950 style pivot irrigation with drip irrigation saves a ton of water and helps them become more drought resistant. It's really helpful to talk about things that we're doing ourselves. I've stepped on the carbon scales. I've measured my carbon footprint. I figured out where it's coming from. A lot of it comes from flying, which is why I love doing talks like this. And then I share what I'm doing with people. I love my plug-in car. And all of our neighbors, after I got that plug-in car, they driving down the street, they stopped and they got out of the car and they said, what is that? Does it have a gas pedal? Does it have a steering wheel? Where did you get it? We had great conversations about my electric car. Eating lower down the food chain reduces our carbon footprint. I know I'm a nerd, but I love my light bulbs. I can get just the right color I like to be just perfect for each room in the house. And there's cool new technology. Everybody likes talking about new technology like solar roofs and solar roads and things like that. It's fascinating when you look at the fact that there's the 10 richest corporations in the entire world. 7 out of 10 of them depend primarily on fossil fuels for their revenues. And one of them, Berkshire Hathaway, has large investments in fossil fuels. That leaves 2 out of 10 that are not based on fossil fuels. Here's number 1, Walmart. And here's number 2, Apple. These are the only two top 10 companies that are not, their revenues are not based primarily or even to a large extent on fossil fuels. And so showing people that businesses are taking this seriously, and Walmart's actually leading an effort to take 100 gigatons, or no, to take 1 gigaton of carbon. Our emissions are currently just over 10 gigatons of carbon annually. Walmart's trying to take an entire gigaton, that's 10% of world emissions, out of the supply chain. That's pretty amazing. Telling stories about what people are doing in the place where we live, as well as in other places, is very powerful. Whether it's churches putting solar panels on the roof, universities investing in renewable energy technology, pollinating plants. So Fresh Energy in Minnesota is putting plants in solar fields to help with bees and butterflies, as well as renewable energy. Livable, walkable cities. There's a lot of stuff that we can talk about that gives people that better vision for a future. And I love talking about Texas. It surprises people that Texas has more wind energy than any other state in the country. We're breaking records every single year. We have the largest army base in the country that went 100% wind and solar because it was cheaper. Everybody likes the fact that they're saving taxpayers millions of dollars. I think it's over $150 million they're saving by going with clean energy. And we even have entire towns going green right here in Texas, not because they're a bunch of tree huggers, but because business students from the local college crunched the numbers, took them to city council, and showed them how much money they could save. That is a pretty cool solution. You all probably know about the We're Still In movement, about all the different organizations that are joining it. We're Still In on Paris. And then talking about what the world is doing, the fact that Morocco has the biggest solar farm for now, it's going to be overtaken very soon, the fact that the UK has the biggest offshore wind farm, the fact that, of course, China has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the entire world. People need to know this information because this is what gives us hope. So how do we talk about climate change? By connecting, by bonding over shared values, by doing some explaining what people want to know, the questions that they have, but most of all, by figuring out ways that we can work together to act, because that is what's going to change our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great, perfect. So I think if Marc Bishop Andrus is okay with us taking 5 minutes for questions, are we good? Okay, great. Wonderful. So we have 5 minutes, and here we go. Your first question. Say your name.
Hi, my name is Chris Taylor. I am a native Texan, and I've been following you a little bit since Years of Living Dangerously. That was an awesome docuseries to see you on. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. A lot of my family members really resonate with the way you talk about things. Being such a conservative state, not being from Austin, it's exciting to see the work that's being done that you're spearheading. So I'm curious, I'm heavily involved with regenerative agriculture. And I know that that is, in my opinion, the biggest solution we have for climate change after we cut emissions. So I'm curious in your work, how often you talk about agriculture, especially being in Texas, in West Texas, and talking about regenerative agriculture, how you frame that, if you talk about it at all. So I know a lot of people in this movement aren't really familiar with the #1 technology we have, just sequester carbon plants, and we're doing it on a daily basis on farms everywhere. So curious how that's involved in your conversations and how you talked about it, if so.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely talk about it because you're totally right. All through the red states, from North Dakota down to Texas, they're huge agricultural economies, and you're totally right. Carbon sequestration in the soil is one of the biggest ways that we can get that stuff out of the atmosphere in a way that's actually beneficial. Because of course, carbon in the soil is like Miracle Grow on steroids. Whether it's, whether it's old-fashioned changing your agricultural practices, whether it's biochar, where you burn agricultural waste at high temperatures and then you plow it back into the soil. And they're also looking, so at our university, we're a land-grant university, we have researchers looking at grazing patterns of cattle to be carbon neutral or even carbon positive, which is so interesting because of course, one of the myths that we address with our global weirding videos is if the entire world went vegan, that would fix climate change, right? No, it wouldn't, unfortunately. So the fact that you can actually have some limited meat production in a carbon neutral or even negative way is just incredible. And then we also have a citizens growers program where we're working with local farms in the area, which are primarily cotton and corn farms, to look at different agricultural techniques that not only save water, but also sequester more carbon through working to change the microbial balances in the soil. So yes, that is an awesome thing. I absolutely love it. And I'm always looking to learn more specifically about that, because I feel like if there's one thing that we don't hear enough about yet, it's that.
Thank you.
That's a great question.
And no, he didn't see that question.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Matt from King County in Washington State. I'm just curious about you mentioned some of the Yale survey data, and they have the 6 segments of Americans. And, I'm just curious, do you find the most progress in that kind of, in engaging with people and changing opinions in that middle of the spectrum of people? Because sometimes when we've been talking about engaging people and, changing opinions, we're dismissive of that hard, we look at the survey data that says these people are not going to change their mind. But it seems like you treat people, more evenly. And do you see progress through that whole spectrum of people, or do you still run into both who are pretty stuck?
Yes, so I just shared my screen with you. I think you can see it. This is what he's referring to. It's something called the 6 Americas of Global Warming, and I use this extensively because I think it's really helpful. It shows how people aren't yes or no on climate change. We actually fall across a spectrum. And interestingly, so this is data from March 2018, so it's pretty recent data. Interestingly, the dismissives are a very small group, very small. Yet, proportionately, they're extremely loud. They populate the comment section and the social media replies. They're concentrated in Washington, D.C. right now. So we get this mental image of dismissives being, 40% of the country, 50% of the country. They're not. They're only 9%. Many people who are cautious might come across as dismissives at first, because they're going to bring up their doubts and concerns first, which makes you think that they're not on board, but really they're just being cautious. They want answers to their questions before they can really be wholehearted on board concerned, because especially they want answers to solution questions. How do I know this won't hurt the economy? How do I know this won't give me a much less pleasant life? So this is really helpful because it helps me focus. Dismissives are not the people whose minds we have to change. And in fact, to change a dismissive's mind, I really do think it takes a miracle. But we absolutely can talk to people who are doubtful and disengaged, and most importantly, people who are cautious, to move them up the ladder. And let me just share something with you that's very interesting. There's some results that are just being submitted for publication right now, so I won't give you too many details. But I participated in an experiment where they showed a video of me talking about climate change to college students from 3 different colleges. All of them were theologically conservative, but in terms of political ideology, they were very different. There was one that was extremely conservative, there was one that was kind of middle of the road, and then there was one in Canada where we don't really use our political affiliation as part of our identity. So there was like no correlation there between what people thought about climate change and how they voted. So we have these 3 different colleges, and they were all watched a video of me for about 45 minutes. And the video was the same, except it had regional information on impacts. So depending on where they live, they would have information on why climate change matters to them in the place where they live. And we tested them before, and then they tested them after watching the video. And here's the fascinating thing. They started in very different places. So super conservative, middle of the road, Canadian, very different places in their opinions on climate change. All 3 groups rose to the same level. So they didn't make the same gains. The most conservative ones made the biggest gains. Isn't that interesting? So it just goes to show it is possible to move people if we can connect over genuinely shared values, and if we can offer solutions that are consistent with and compatible with who they already believe themselves to be. Because as George Marshall says, who's a great expert on climate communication, he wrote the book on how our brains are wired to ignore climate change. Very good book. As he says, we all want to be a better version of ourselves. So we need climate solutions that make us feel as if we are a better and more true version of who we already are.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katharine, so much for joining us. I'd like to introduce Bishop Marc Andrus. The Right Reverend Marc and Handley Andrus is the 8th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California. He was installed as Bishop in 2006, a position of oversight for a diocese comprised of 24,000 communicants in Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties, in the cities of Los Altos and Palo Alto. Bishop Andrus' leadership has focused on key issues related to peace and justice, including immigration reform, civil rights for LGBTQ persons, healthcare, and climate change. Early in his tenure at the diocese, Bishop Andrus co-chaired a community coalition that paved the way for the rebuilding of St. Luke's Hospital in San Francisco. More recently, his climate advocacy work has taken him to the Paris UN Climate Conference in 2015 and 2016, and 2017 in Bonn, as well as the Dakota Access Pipeline demonstrations at Standing Rock, North Dakota. Bishop Andrus is a member of the We Are Still In Leaders Circle, a diverse group of ambassadors for American climate action. He also serves on the boards of the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, California Pacific Medical Center, the Episcopal Impact Fund, the Episcopal School for Deacons, Episcopal Community Services, and the American Bach Soloists, among other foundations. Bishop Andrus is married to Sheila Andrus, PhD, former director of the Sparkman Center at the University of Alabama and Birmingham School of Public Health, and they have 2 daughters, Chloe and Pilar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Lisa. Isn't Katharine Hayhoe fantastic?
Yeah.
I love her so much. We met in Paris at the UN Climate Summit there, and I've been so happy to follow her work. I'm talking about faith bodies and their role in climate change. I was on the opening panel at the alternate US pavilion in Bonn that Mayor Bloomberg and Tom Steyer funded. And there was some lead up to the panel, 3 or 4 people, and they each went through the kind of the litany of who's in the We're Still In movement. And that would be cities, states, regions, and businesses. And no faith bodies at that point, no universities, and no tribes. But when they got to the panel, Ann Kerr, who was from Ceres, who was chairing the panel, started with me for some reason and said, "What do you think about this? What's going on? We're Still In movement." And I said, "Well, I kind of feel like the Holy Ghost here, but nobody can see us." So the fact is, faith bodies have a tremendous amount already for decades to do with combating climate change and environmental degradation and working against eco-injustice. But I would say that with the world, we are coming into our own in a new level of consciousness. So this is the opening slide from a fantastic application. Let's see, I want to start here. This is what we took to Paris. In addition to what everybody else does at the UN Climate Summits, networking, learning, advocacy, we also said we wanted to take our spiritual values. It is our contention that everyone is working from a certain set of values, that we carry them within us. You don't have to be aligned with a religious body of any sort. There are these motivating values. And spiritual practices are the things that cultivate those values. So every day in what's called the Green Zone in Paris, and then in Marrakesh, and then in Bonn, and perhaps in Poland this year, it's unclear what that's going to look like, we would stand in the public space with hundreds, even thousands of people streaming by and have these daily segments of meditation around these certain spiritual values. In Paris, we started with compassion, forgiveness, reconciliation, and courage. And we added more in Marrakesh, and we added more in Bonn. The most remarkable experience was in Marrakesh. So we had a totally different culture, totally different country, a different year, We were in Marrakesh when President Trump was elected. So it's a unique experience to be with 40,000 climate activists and learn in the course of the night that a climate denier and somebody who's guaranteeing he's taking us out of the Paris Agreement was elected president. And the We're Still In movement was born then. But what was remarkable was in these daily meditations, groups of young adult Muslims were the majority group that wanted to talk about spiritual values. Up to 30 and 40 young professionals, graduate students in environmental engineering and in architecture would come, and we planned these segments for half an hour so that people could get there, talk, and go. And they sat down, these young adults, on the floor in the flow of the public space, and would talk for 2 hours. And one of the things their message was, we have the technological know-how. We know what to do technologically. We are looking for the spiritual as the basis of how we are going to move forward as a planet and as a people. So I think this is something that the faith bodies are nurturing. We don't own it. As I said, it's the common property of humans and maybe non-humans, but we are nurturing it. That is what faith bodies do, is nurture those values. Tomorrow in Grace Cathedral, there's going to be a tremendous multi-faith service that's part of the kickoff of the GCAS. And it's called a service of wondering and commitment. It will be led by folks from indigenous small-scale religions, from Hinduism, from Judaism, from Buddhism, from Christianity, and Islam. All of these groups are working on a certain shared idea that wonder is a sign of love. When you meet somebody at a body, somebody, it might be another species, it might be a complex, it might be an ecosystem. And you have that experience of wonder where your kind of breath catches and your heart expands. That's the first sign of falling in love. And we defend that which we love. So we're starting with this kind of reawakening of where did you have that experience of wonder in your life? When did it happen? Maybe it's happened many times. First time I asked this question was in Alabama when I was serving as the bishop there. And a woman in her 60s was in this group, and she raised her hand and said, my first experience of wonder was as a 5th grader here in public school in Alabama. And I looked through a microscope for the first time, and I saw a paramecium, and I fainted. And I get that, it's so beautiful. And then another woman talked about garden slugs and how she had battled them, putting out little things of beer so they would drown and die. And one day she was walking out of her kitchen door on a beautiful sunny morning, summer morning in Alabama, and there was one making its way across the steppe, and they're iridescent, and it was glowing, and she suddenly saw it as beautiful. And she said, I still battle them, but I love them now. I just want them not to be, eating my flowers and herbs and so on. So spiritual values are one of the things that we bring to this conversation. This is the landing page for a web-based application that Lisa Altieri has developed, and that Sheila Andrus and Nancy Grove have developed so that it's usable by the whole Episcopal Church. So this is if you use a web-based application to track your steps, or your exercise, or your nutrition, or your calories. This is like that, but for carbon. And it goes across 5 different areas of choices, like transportation, nutrition, home energy. And then it has 3 levels of difficulty, from easy, medium, to hard. And it's designed, what Sheila and Nancy and others contributed, is something that takes this basic web application, which any group can suit to themselves, and make it something that Episcopalians, the denomination I'm part of in the Christian world, would feel welcoming and would draw them in. I'm showing you this because this is the grassroots way at the individual level that the Episcopal Church, which committed itself this summer as a denomination, a 3 million person denomination, to do its part to keep the Paris Agreement. Well, how are we going to do that? Larry Rasmussen, the environmental ethicist, has said that the most difficult transformation in human history is the transformation from an industrial culture to a sustainable life. If you've made commitments that are difficult in your life, you know that they are both those things. They are commitments and they are difficult. And many of us fail in our commitments. So we wanted to build something that would help people make their commitments, make choices, and keep them. But further, we are a community. The Episcopal Church is a community of communities. And so if you are using this web-based application as an individual, it can aggregate up to the level of your congregation and to your diocese, which is a region, and from the region to the whole Episcopal Church. So this is transformative. Businesses are bringing their own gifts to the We're Still In movement. Cities, states, regions, tribes, and universities are bringing their own gifts to the We're Still In movement. What the faith bodies, in part, are bringing, in addition to the values I mentioned, is the transformation of millions, in fact, potentially billions of individual lives to sustainability. To illustrate that, the Episcopal Church, our formal name is the Episcopal Church USA, but in fact, we are an international body. The Episcopal Church is one province of 38 that comprise what's called the Anglican Communion. And these are the member nations of the Episcopal Church. There are 16 nations and state and territories that are part of what we call the Episcopal Church, including Haiti, 7 Central American countries, and Taiwan and Micronesia. So already we are a body that can make transformations beyond the United States. This is a global problem. And as the former Archbishop of Canterbury, the spiritual head of the Anglican Communion, Rowan Williams, said, it takes a global body to meet a global problem. So that's the Episcopal Church. This is the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion is the 3rd largest Christian body. It's 85 million people across the world. Those are the provinces of the Anglican Communion. We are joined together in a more intentional way than simply being human. There are some areas in which we are already sharing a community. When I meet Anglicans from the Solomon Islands, where they are losing their lives, literally, their culture and their lives, we have something we can begin to talk about. In addition to our love of the planet, we also share a way of being a faithful person. So that's not, I said we're the 3rd largest Christian body. Eastern Orthodoxy is the 2nd largest Christian body. That's 200 million people. And the Roman Catholic Church is 1 billion people. That's Christianity. That leaves out all the Protestant denominations of Christianity. Buddhism is 100 million people. Hinduism is somewhere in between, somewhat lower than that. And there are the small-scale indigenous religions. All of these are an enormous number of people to work towards climate solutions. To recognize that is important as we're moving forward together in the We're Still In movement. And finally, we are coming together across our faiths, and we're learning from each other. So for instance, you heard Katharine talk about plant-based solutions, and that we don't have to, maybe it's best if there's a mix, but with much less animal protein. From the Bhumi project within Hinduism and its executive director, Gopal Patel, one of the key pieces of their movement towards climate solutions within Hinduism is a plant-based diet. That is not the main emphasis within most of Christianity, but we are learning from that as Christians. I think if you read the book Eat, Pray, Love, or watch the movie, remember that the author says that every city has a characteristic word and it's a fun game. She's got New York in there, and Los Angeles, and Rome, and Florence, I think. What would San Francisco's characteristic be? Or your own home city? But you could also say that for religions. There are kind of characteristic ideas, values, that, like the ones I was talking about earlier, that are not owned entirely and not limiting to each religion, but characteristic of that religion. I would say that compassion is a characteristic value for Buddhism. I would say that forgiveness is a characteristic value within Christianity. So we have a way of learning from each other by our emphases on different aspects. Our religions are also centered geographically, not limited, but centered. And they are enculturated in the places where they began or where they are flourishing. And we can also learn from each other in that way. And at the UN Climate Summits, this is literally happening. We are working as interfaith groups towards climate solutions together with civil society partners. So thanks for listening to all that, and we have about 4 minutes for questions.
Okay, we have time maybe for one or two quick questions. Does anybody have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, actually the camera will follow you.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Ravi Nicholson with Climate Link. Thank you for your talk today, Bishop.
Thanks.
Have you found that there are certain theological arguments that people use to deny or to argue against climate change more than others?
Well, you know Lynn White's famous essay from the 70s that put a lot of blame on Christianity with an interpretation of a passage in Genesis that says that God gave the earth to humanity for dominion purposes. That is a famous essay, and there's truth to it. It's also, we've moved a long way, past that. There are still people that make that argument. There are many people outside of the faith bodies who find people in religions to be inhibitory to progressive values. The Episcopal Church, which is a progressive church, is often tarred in the brush of intolerance that we can witness. If you saw the film Milk, here about Harvey Milk in our city, in our area, there was a lot of religious intolerance. Anita Bryant was shown and so on. The only positive religious figure identifiable in that film was an Episcopal priest from Berkeley, but he wasn't identified and the church wasn't identified, and the overall picture of Christianity was a retrogressive, negative idea. Before 1960, people like myself had the bully pulpit, that is, proponents of what's called the mainline denominations. Episcopalians are among them. We are not there anymore, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So reporters are not looking to talk to the Bishop of California. They're looking to talk to somebody from Willow Creek or from the evangelical area. We've lost that big pulpit that we had at that time. There's a lot of historical reasons for that, and some of them are good reasons. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Sarita.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the
Yeah, well, it depends on me, right? Right.
So I'm a Christian to the core, and I've often wondered with the resistance why Christianity doesn't use biblical arguments to prove that climate change is real.
Yeah.
Because the word also talks about that, right?
Very much so.
So, yeah. So I'm just wondering if you've had any conversations or thoughts about that.
Thanks for the question. There are profound and strong biblical, in the Christian world, arguments to say that we should be better stewards and or better inhabitants of the earth and live a more sustainable life. I think partly my answer to Mr. Mickelson is here we don't get the airtime to say those arguments. They've been articulated. We're talking about them. I'm preaching about them every Sunday and other occasions. But we're preaching to a kind of closed group. Also, there's a lot less biblical literacy today. People do not read the Bible. In the 19th century, if you had a few books on your shelf, it would be Shakespeare, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and the Bible. And that's not the case now. So you actually have to build, in terms of what Katharine was saying about explaining, you got a lot of explaining to do to even reference what you and I would call basic biblical stories, things that I was raised knowing, just knowing. They are not known. In the Bay Area and in Seattle, we are the most secular part of the United States. And I think that's a good thing in many ways. Why? Because it gives us a lot of work to do. But on the other hand, in the category of age and demographically under 35, it's almost 97% of the Bay Area in that age group does not go to church, mosque, or synagogue. That's huge. That's maybe on equal with Western Europe and the UK. So the biblical literacy for many of those young adults is almost zero. So, making an argument based on the Bible is not, you've got to go a long distance to get that to work. Thank you all so much.
Okay, so Lindsay X is AICP and LEED, our lead green associate, is the climate program manager for the city of Fort Collins, where she leads the systematic implementation of Fort Collins' ambitious climate action goals of 20% reduction below 2005 levels, 80% below by 2030, and to be carbon neutral by 2030. Okay, that's ambitious. Lindsay has over 17 years of experience in both public and private sectors implementing planning and sustainability efforts in Colorado, Utah, and Alaska. She's been with the city since 2010, spending her first 5 years in the planning department, developing long-range planning efforts, such as the 100-year vision for all residents to access nature in the city before transitioning to sustainability in 2015. Lindsay is excited to share how Fort Collins and other cities are co-creating their engagement efforts and how to achieve ambitious climate action plan. One of my favorite examples is how Fort Collins partnered with the local university to truly understand the barriers and benefits for the average resident to taking action on climate. Community members were paid for their time, which was standard in researching, is still new for cities and practical applications. I can't wait to hear more. She serves on the board of the Sustainable Living Association and is always trying to find ways to get her 3-year-old twins out into nature or helping with their 1-acre farm, urban farm just outside of town. She holds a Master of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning degree from Utah State University and a bachelor's degree in Natural Resource Management from Oregon State University. Lindsay, thank you so much for being with us, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Lisa, for having us and organizing this amazing, amazing crew of folks today. I am so excited to share about Fort Collins' work and others cities and how we're leading engagement efforts on the ground. I think it's so great to tee up Fort Collins after some of the broader discussions about how we need solutions, and that's going to be entirely the focus of my quick presentation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, assuming that I know how to do this.
There you go. There's a bottom there. Oop, got it.
I've got it. Okay. So, one moment. So I love kicking off any talk that I give about climate action, about why cities. Why should cities be leading in the space around climate? And we've heard so much today already about how cities are really on the front lines of climate action. And I also like to highlight that we also have the most levers to pull when it comes to making a difference. So we are the ones that are managing and influencing our transportation systems. We are the ones that have the land use and zoning codes to determine how we build out as communities. And in many locations, we also control our building codes. We also have the trust and relationships with the community and that one-on-one shared values that have been such a critical piece of the conversation today. And the best part I always feel like about cities leading on climate action is that we get to tailor solutions to our needs. So what might work for Fort Collins may not work for, say, a San Antonio to achieve our goals. Just really quickly about Colorado, we're a little bit north of Denver. Our population is just over 160,000 and we're experiencing significant growth. We also have Colorado State University, just like Dr. Hayhoe, we have a land-grant university within Fort Collins. We're a council manager form of government, and we're very lucky to have our own electric utility, which is a very significant lever to pull in this space. And we also really love to call Fort Collins a purple community. Unlike our colleagues just down the road in Boulder, we really like to play around the 50-50 yard line. Also amazing bike infrastructure for anybody who's ever been here. And when the bishop spoke about the one word that really defines your community, Fort Collins was highlighted at the Smithsonian as a community of innovation. This is really where, this is the space we love to play in, and we're so excited to be innovating our way to a carbon neutral future. So you heard our goals. Yes, they're absolutely ambitious. The good news is that we're already almost to our 2020 goals. We're 17% below our 2005 levels, even while our population and our gross municipal product has been growing. When we adopted our goals, very similar to what you've been hearing today, we acknowledge that our greatest challenges to achieving the goals weren't necessarily technological. Instead, they were around engagement and they were around financing. So I'm going to, because this is focused on engagement, I'm just going to talk about some of the work that we've been trying to do to break through that barrier around engagement. And this is Lindsay X's language about participation, co-creation, and leadership. But I really think that all the cities that I talk to are focused on their engagement at different levels. And importantly, I note at the bottom that 80% of Fort Collins residents really support the city investing in programs and policies to address climate change. And I know those are high numbers for some communities in the room, but what we also hear is while many of our residents support this work, they don't know exactly what they can do. So we are working on providing avenues from a participation level, how they can co-create with us, and also provide self-leadership. And I'll go through a couple of examples. When I think about participation, I think a lot about the marketing campaigns that you're seeing across the country around climate action. New York City is such a great example in this space. They have Birdie with Green YC, and Birdie gives very simple, positive messages that any resident can take, and they're very focused campaigns that many New York City folks recognize. Austin is another great example, very similar to the work that Lisa's going to share with you later. They really frame their work in a series of, where are you at? Right, we talk a lot in the community engagement world about meeting people where they're at. So are you at the place in your climate action journey where you just need to adjust your thermostat? or more often what we hear, just program your programmable thermostat as well. We heard Katharine talking about replacing light bulbs with LEDs as a more intermediate step because that costs money. And then how can you even go further when you're making that next replacement of your appliance? Here in Fort Collins, we launched our first marketing campaign in 2018. And as you heard Lisa mention, we held a focus group with our local university where we paid attendees a small amount to attend this evening workshop. But the reason that we did that was because we really wanted to make sure that we could actually get a representative sample into the room and not just one of those Americas that you saw in the 6 Americas slide. So we asked them what are the top benefits and what are the top barriers to taking action on these 2 efforts that you see on the screen. And it was so fascinating for us because we knew that there might be some resistance on LEDs around it's new technology, I don't really get it. But one of the top solutions that we learned that was a barrier for folks was around what do I do with my existing light bulbs? I don't know about recycling them. I don't know what I can do with them. So we made sure in our marketing campaigns to include language on that. And what we're proud to say is that we've already engaged over 5,000 Fort Collins households in this campaign, and this could have a significant impact on our goals as we move forward. And each of these 3 examples, New York City, Austin, Fort Collins, they're all really focused on simple actions that people can take. And that's a little bit of removing the barriers. I know there's a session on community-based social marketing a little bit later, but making climate action simple is one of the best things that our cities can do. So in that engagement spectrum, moving up a little bit, we talk about co-creation as well. So how can the city partner with the community to develop solutions? Earlier this year, we held an innovation summit, which was over 2 days, and we worked with our community to develop challenge statements. What are our greatest challenges as a community to reducing our emissions in energy, waste, transportation, and in behavior change areas? And we use these statements to guide a broader community-wide challenge that we called the Innovate Fort Collins Challenge, where the city leveraged $200,000 of our resources with private sector resources and private sector ideas to achieve our climate goals. And happy to speak more to that as well. And then a community advisory committee to help give feedback and help us really creating the solutions that we need to achieve our climate goals. This is one of my favorite examples around leadership in this space. So often cities are trying to take the lead with our programs and connecting people to take advantage of an energy efficiency rebate. But Denver and Lakewood, Colorado have been leading this effort called Sustainable Neighborhoods. And I love to think of it like LEED, but for existing neighborhoods. So neighborhoods are selecting the credits that they might take, whether they're establishing recycling programs or engaging all of their residents at all ages in community gardening to take sustainable actions. And what I love about this is in just these few years, they've engaged 14,000 residents in these efforts on an extremely low budget. And it's about neighborhoods choosing what matters most to them. And then finally, and our next speaker is going to be talking about this as well, equity is really a space that's becoming a focus for cities. And I think I've heard it from another speaker already today, and you're going to hear it again from me, that many cities would acknowledge that we have very far to go in this space. But I just want to highlight 2 examples from Fort Collins and work with other cities. The example on the left is something that our utilities has done and we're calling it the shift model. And we're asking the question, what if the most efficient model that's out in the sales floor was the same price as the best seller? So on the left, you can see that the best selling washing machine was 15% of the sales and the most efficient model was only 0.3% of the sales. We adjusted our rebate, again, municipal utility, to be the exact same price as the best seller. And in just a short time, the efficiency model sales have increased by 200%. And the best selling model, or let's call it the former best seller, is not even on the market anymore in that particular sales location. We're also partnering with the USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and cities across the country. This effort's led by Burlington, Vermont, to develop a toolkit for how cities can be more supportive in this energy transformation. How do we really ensure all of our residents and businesses can come along in this space? So I just want to close on my last slide with what's next. And I think what's so important whenever we talk about this work, especially with other cities and residents, is to be honest about what hasn't worked. And so I love to close with lessons learned. So of course, every one of us knows this as a fundamental rule, but we've got to know our audience. Again, what's going to work in Fort Collins may not work in Cleveland, may not work in Portland. So it's really important for us to tailor our language on that. I always talk about that sometimes talking about climate sexy means we don't talk about climate. And there's a lot of information on that we can get into as well. My key tagline for the work that we do here in Fort Collins is we keep it positive, we keep it pragmatic, and we make it personal. So we really try and tell a story whenever we can. Loved what Katharine was talking about with her EV. I've had the same experience with my electric lawnmower where all my neighbors are asking about it. I will note they're often asking my husband about it and not me, even though it's definitely my lawnmower. And then keeping it pragmatic is about how do we make sure that it's cost effective. And then when you think about knowing your audience, when you're framing up your climate messaging, thinking about it from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a security or resilience perspective as well is just as important. And we're talking about how cities are leading the efforts on engagement, but it's just as important for cities to listen as it is to lead. We heard Sierra Club talk about this earlier, but it is important for us to set goals. And I would challenge all of you, if you're not already in a city space, to see what your community is already doing in this space and think about how you can engage with them as well. And most importantly, again, going back to that values conversation, really what motivates your community? What is a space that's really important for them? How are those values manifesting in your community? Again, in Fort Collins, that's innovation. So we talk a lot about a climate economy and how are we going to innovate our way into a climate economy in Fort Collins. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so Sarita Turner is ISC's Institute for Sustainable Communities, Director of Inclusive Communities. In this role, she oversees ISC's Partnership for Resilient Communities, strengthens the equity and inclusion components of ISC's US-based clean energy resilience and sustainability program. She is also a key advisor to ISC's leadership on advancing equity and inclusion through all of ISC's programs, internal systems, and practices. Sarita has deep experience working with community-based organizations, city government, and a broad array of institutional partners to advance equitable solutions to the barriers and challenges facing many communities. A nationally recognized leader, a trainer and speaker on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and implicit bias, Sarita sits on the board of the Grounded Solutions Network, which works to connect local affordable housing organizations with national experts to advance affordable housing solutions. Sarita, thank you so much for joining us.
My Toastmasters training. Somebody might be in the room spying. Like, oh, she's a Toastmaster. She didn't approach the podium properly. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for having me. I really appreciate it. She offered me the opportunity to either join in person or join virtually as well. And I decided to come all the way over here from Oakland to hang out with you guys. So thank you for having me. Very enlightening and interesting conversation so far. So when I walked in the room, I don't know, I can't remember who was speaking, but she was saying if you do something enough or say it enough, it becomes like normalized. And so I was like, oh, because what I heard and felt in that moment was violence against Black men, right? Them being murdered, and how we're becoming numb as a society to that. And I only bring that up to say, not to be a bummer, but to say that, you know, we hear things and experience them differently based on where we're from and what our exposures in life have been. So that's really what I want to talk about a little bit, is how the experiences and exposures and opportunities that are available for all of us in this sector, in the industry, are not reaching everyone nearly as well as we can do. So I'll just back up and say a little bit about ISC. We're an international nonprofit. I've been there about 6 months, so forgive me. I came from a national nonprofit. We're an international nonprofit that works on climate solutions, and we're in Asia. We have offices in Bangladesh and in China and India, and then we're also in the US. And so we really have a theory of change that believes that resilient, sustainable communities are communities that are socially, economically, and environmentally resilient. And that without all three of those things working together, you do not have a resilient community. It cannot be resilient against man-made or natural disasters or any of the kinds of pressures that we all experience in life from time to time, or many of us do. And that to have those kinds of communities, we have to forge connections, foster investment, increase knowledge and skills, strengthen institutional effectiveness, and curate and test solutions. And we have to do field building, expand availability of technical expertise, amplify investment, and really activate networks around the nation. So in our work, primarily in the United States is where I'll focus, we've really learned some things that we know we need to address in our work, and that we need to really call on the field to address. And those are disparities in access and participation are really challenging the climate field to be effective and to get to scale. We know that we have underfunded and fragmented support systems broadly, but especially for local communities, and that there is a growing credibility gap between rhetoric, results, and risk. So we have a credibility gap with communities of color because we haven't been inclusive as a field, right? Us progressives have not walked our talk in this field, right? We haven't been inclusive. And we also have rhetoric coming from the opposition trying to convince communities that climate change is a risk to them, that engaging in climate resilience activities is a risk to them. So they're trying to pull people of color to their side of the argument. And we already have a system that's built on mistrust. So what happens when we know that people of color and poor people are the most vulnerable to climate change? Does everybody know that? Do we? Because Lisa only gave me 15 minutes, so I can't, I gotta get with it here, right? And I already took up 5 chit-chatting about coming from Oakland. So we know that, right, poor people and people of color are the most vulnerable. We also know that people perish for lack of knowledge, right, Bishop? They do. If you know better, you do better. If you know better, that means you believe it, and you take it in, you embrace it, and you do better if you know better. And we do know, right, that the media largely has not, lately is doing a better job, but largely has not pointed out the inequities in the impacts of climate change and how people of color and poor people are usually left worse off when there's a climate challenge, right? Katrina taught us that very well. So why are things this way? Let's go back a little bit in history and talk about legal practices in this country. Are people familiar with redlining? People familiar with the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? That was FHA back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And that was the government entity that backed home loans, right? And said, we're not going to do that for Black people. We're not going to do that for Black people. And in fact, all of the resources that we put into public housing, we're going to allow Black people to live in them, but they have to live separate from white people. We cannot race mix. We have to have people living separately because it just is not conscionable in this country that we would have whites and Blacks integrated. So we had legal land use planning. This is a land use planning map, a real map from the city of Baltimore. How many planners are in here? Any planners in the room? All right, you guys are going to be on the hot seat. So we had legal systems of land use planning. Lindsay just talked about the power of the tools of land use planning. Legal systems of that were discriminatory. Redlined, Black people live there, don't invest, it's not worthy of making investments there. So carrying that forward, this is a land use, that was a map of Baltimore. In 2012, here's where the food deserts are in Baltimore. Here's where the dirty streets and alleys are in Baltimore. Here's where the vacant boarded up properties are in Baltimore, where the foreclosure crisis hit the hardest, where the most predatory loans were made, where those that didn't live in the community and were renting them out and lost them, abandoned them, and the banks didn't take care of them and mow the lawns and all that kind of stuff, right? And this is today, this is a survey of government attitudes. And so you see the things that government thinks are most important are at the top. And the things that government thinks are most important are at the bottom, right? Inclusion and civic engagement, environment and resiliency, public health and healthcare, social services, all at the bottom. This is today. So this is what we wind up with, right, when we operate in systems like that. So I showed you the history and then showed you the government attitudes today to make the point that we are still operating in those discriminatory systems and ways of working and making decisions and leveraging investments and figuring out what people deserve and who we're going to go talk to, where we feel safe to go spread our message, and is our message even going to be, do we think about tailoring it to folks who don't speak the same language in English even that we speak. So if we don't start to address those things by including people in the economy, right? So we have a sub-economy operating in the climate and sustainability field. And this is just in the solar workforce that we see how horrible of a job we're doing in terms of inclusion in the workforce, right? So we're never gonna change this trajectory that we're on because people of color are becoming what? The majority in this nation. By 2040, 2050, this nation is going to be majority people of color. California is already majority people of color. Texas is majority people of color, right? And that's a thing to celebrate. But if we don't invest in the very people who are driving our population growth and who are going to be our elected leaders and our workforce and our elected officials, we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket, right? So we have to think about how we're going to do things differently. And we have to recognize that in spite of all those conditions that I named and showed you horrible pictures of to make indelible imprints on your mind so you think about it all night and all day tomorrow, next day and the next day. is that those communities, the people that live in them, are probably more resilient than any single one of us could ever imagine being. They have survived and been through hell, and they're still here, and they are able to tell us what will work in their communities, right? To engage them in this resilience conversation. And we have to listen to that, because if we go there talking about climate science, right, we may like get some eyes rolled at us, right? Because I don't have a job, or my housing is molded. So here you are, you want me to listen to some conversation that has no meaning for me, but we can connect that meaning if we're really willing to put our money where our mouths are and connect opportunities in this field and ways that building resilient communities actually protects folks from having even more devastation and harm done. If we can make those connections, people are happy to participate. And so I just want to talk real quickly, a lot of strategies are happening, but the ones that are happening that are the most successful are the ones that I'm leading, right? So the Institute for Sustainable Communities, we have a program called the Partnership for Resilient Communities. We're providing resources and capacity building support in historic communities of color, right now in 4 communities: Baltimore, Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Detroit. I know that says San Diego, but it shouldn't. I'm gonna get somebody. And we're providing financial resources as well as capacity building support. Those communities are educating their broader community members, and they're engaging in strategies like putting solar on affordable housing to cut back on solar costs. So then you can engage someone in a conversation because it's really impacting them and it's really happening in their community with them and for them. In Baltimore, they're doing solar job training, and the on-the-job training component is actually putting solar and battery storage backup on community-based organizations that have now created emergency hubs for community to be to take advantage of, and have already in Baltimore due to a power outage, right? And folks were able to go there as a cooling center, access cooking opportunities, and also power your cell phones and that kind of thing. So those folks are also influencing their local governments to promote policies that help create pathways to resilience for broader community participation and foster resources for those communities. So I could go on and talk some more about all the great things that are happening with the Partnership for Resilient Communities, but I think the thing that I want to leave you with is those guys are putting the solar panels on the Resilience Hub in Baltimore. The thing I want to leave you with is that we have to do better in terms of how we're engaging with the populations that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarita, so much for joining us. I really wish we could have given you 2 hours or more.
Well, I would have taken it.
So Amanda introduced me a little bit, which I really appreciated earlier on. And I do want to let you know, so we are planning to still end at 4. I'm going to do a very quick presentation, and then we have one more speaker coming after that who's going to talk about community-based social marketing. So my name is Lisa Altieri. I'm CEO and, I'm founder and president of Community Climate Solutions, which is a nonprofit that's working with cities to help them reach their climate action plan goals with through community engagement. I'm also the founder of Climate Solutions Net, which is a software startup creating online tools to make climate solutions accessible to everyone. So with that, really important, a couple things I'd like to make sure that you can take away from my 5 minutes here. 40% of US emissions are driven by basic household activities in the areas of electricity, home heating, transportation, food, and waste. That's 40% of our US emissions. With recent tech advances, there are now low or no emissions alternatives for all those 5 categories that are becoming affordable and accessible. This was not the case 5 years ago. This was not the case 10 years ago. But we're in a very, very special moment where these alternatives are now available and accessible to people. And people do not need to give up their quality of life to make these choices. And they also don't need to decide between making one of these choices or putting money into their kids' college fund. These options are now here, which means that people can have a huge impact on reaching Paris goals and making this transition happen. So imagine if we all took 5 basic actions in these areas, we could lower US emissions by nearly 40%. The other thing that I want to quickly touch on is that, and Katharine talked about this, but this is from the Yale Climate Communication Study. Most people are concerned. They believe it's happening, they're concerned. You saw the interest in renewable energy, but they don't know what to do. So the level of understanding for most people about what the solutions are and what they personally can do is very, very low. So our whole goal with our project, both with cities and with our online tools, is to change that, is to bring solutions to people, make it extremely easy for them to quickly learn what the solutions are, what they can do, hook them up with resources, connect them in with their community to support each other, and go take action. So our goal is within 5 or 10 years to have a literacy raise where when I go and I talk to anybody on the street and I ask them, what are the solutions to climate change? They'll say, it's this, 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 and this, and I did half of those already, and I'm going to do the other 2 in the next 5 years. That's my goal. So with that, a little bit about our tools. So I spent 5 years in my own backyard in Palo Alto. I volunteered to lead a city-initiated effort to engage residents to take individual action towards our community, our citywide climate goals. And so I said, yay, this is awesome, I volunteer. So we spent 5 years doing all sorts of different things. We were just volunteers in our own community. So we came up with all sorts of great, fun things to do. But we weren't making the deep dive that we really wanted to make. But we definitely saw successes. And so I started to look at what was working and what wasn't working, and where were our barriers, and what would it look like to do a community-wide engagement effort on climate solutions and really have success. So the nutshell is information is important, helping folks understand what those solutions are and what they can do and getting them good information. But what really moved the needle was when we connected them together, when they started to talk to each other, talk to their neighbors, work in teams, run community challenges. Then suddenly people were in and they were starting to take action to get stuff done. So I started to envision an online platform that would facilitate as a tool, not a replacement for in-person activity, but as a tool to facilitate this, to make it really easy for communities to decide that they were going to do this, and for residents to get on board, find out what's going on, connect with each other, and take it and move it forward. So we've created an online platform to empower individual action in this community-based. So everyone who uses this works together with others in their own community. And it's very simple. They create a profile. We have an energy profile. They answer a few questions so we can show them their current impact. They take actions, and then they work together. So a little bit deeper dive here. As I said, it's community-based. This is our Fremont site here. And so each site has local photos, local branding, local messaging, so it's comfortable for folks in their own community. And focuses on the things that are important to them. The first thing we do for users is we help them discover their impact. As I said, we ask them a few questions, we show them what their impact is, where it's coming from, and then we help do a little education about what that looks like relatively. What does my house look like compared to my city or the US or maybe the UK or China or India? And then we help them find actions that are right for their household. So there are a lot of actions, which is good because not all actions are going to fit for everybody, but we have them broken down into a couple of big action categories that I mentioned earlier, so it makes it really kind of easy. But then within that, there's actions they can choose that fit to their household budget, fit to their lifestyle, and work for them. And then we have really robust analytics on this. So for each user, the estimates that we give them on actions are based on their current actions, their local utility carbon intensity, their local energy pricing. So that these analytics are really strong. And we give them points, but points, 1 point is equal to 1 pound of CO2 reduced per year or 10 gallons of water. So they're meaningful and they make sense. So robust resources, we help them see what is this, what am I doing, how long is it going to take, how much is it going to cost, and then we hook them up with resources, really important. They'll see resources available for them in their city or by their utility so that we can help them get plugged into things that can help them move those actions forward and get them done. We do FAQs, top questions they may have about that action. We're adding in soon a more robust even checklist where we'll walk them through, say, have you done this step? They'll say yes, and then we'll do, we'll walk them through the next step so we can really help them sort of walk through and get these actions completed. And then they can chat with each other. They can ask each other's questions or you can post a tip for your neighbors and help each other succeed. And then they see the actions they've chosen, they set themselves a goal of when they want to have it done, and then at the top they can see if they finish everything, how much they're going to save and reduce their impact. They track their progress for what they completed, they see their points, savings, how much their impact has gone down, and then they can work together. So we benchmark folks, so just like O-Power, set up an average impact for a baseline household in their community, and then everyone's benchmarked to that. So as they go below that average baseline household, they go up in levels. We're going to be adding in some badges for different completing different action sets. And then finally, they can work together in small teams of 5 or 10 households. They get a whole dashboard to track their progress and work together. They can also tag their points to a community group, which could be a faith community, it could be a school, it could be a senior group. And then we also track by geographic, like neighborhood or city. And then we can present the citywide accomplishments, and then we can also track for teams, community groups, and neighborhoods some relative rankings to run local challenges. So this provides a tool. And then finally, folks, when they complete an action, we encourage them to post a photo, share it with their groups, and they can share it out to social media. So it basically provides a tool that local communities can use to do robust engagement that's low cost and effective, where they don't have to go put all this information together. They don't have to try to run all this on Excel spreadsheets. They can simply go run a challenge and have fun with it and let the tool do the rest. We're launching right now. We have 20 cities and counties across the U.S. that we're piloting with and launching soon, and we're gearing up for a national launch in early 2019, which will include a rollout to the congregations of the Episcopal Church. So that is our project, and I'm going to quickly switch over to Jennifer Tabanico, who is our last speaker. And again, we'll send contact information out for everyone. We don't have time for questions. But we'll quickly switch over to, and I'll introduce Jennifer, and she will bring us home. And there she is. I can see you. Hold on. There you are. I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, kind of. Can you increase your volume a little bit there?
Let's see. How is that? Is that a little bit better?
So much better.
Okay, I'll just lean in a little bit closer.
Okay.
All right, well.
Let me quickly introduce you. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, hold on a second. So Jennifer Tabanico is president and owner of Action Research, a firm that specializes in changing behavior for the public good by applying marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote clean, healthy, and sustainable communities. Jennifer has a Master of Arts degree in experimental psychology and more than 15 years of experience developing and implementing community-based programs for public and private agencies. Her work has spanned a broad range of social and community issues, including water quality, waste and recycling, litter prevention, energy efficiency, water conservation, and sustainable forestry. She has worked for a range of public and private clients, including the City and County of San Diego, the American Forest Foundation, the New York Energy Research and Development Authority, and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Ms. Tabanico has authored several publications in both academic and technical outlets, including the Journal of Environmental Psychology, Social Influence, and Social Marketing Quarterly. Jennifer also serves as an instructor for the University of California, San Diego Extension's Behavior Change and Sustainability Certification Program. So Jennifer, I think we're probably okay to go ahead and 15 minutes. Are you good?
Yes, I'd love to comment on all the great things that the other speakers shared, in particular the emphasis on figuring out what works in different places and the role that cities have. It's just really so tied into what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about 30 minutes of content in about 15. So I'll go fairly quickly, but encourage you to follow up if you have questions and learning more about this approach. So essentially, addressing these global climate issues is going to require, as we know, behavior change on the part of individuals and communities. So in this presentation, I am going to review an evidence-based process for developing programs that change behavior and talk a little bit about the science behind some of the commonly used behavior change tools and talk about how you can best apply them to maximize their effectiveness. So as Lisa stated, I'm president and owner of Action Research, and we are dedicated to applying both marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote clean, healthy, and sustainable communities. We've been working in this space for over 17 years and have used this approach across a wide range of domains. So the first point that I want to make today is that behavior matters. And we've heard this behavior mentioned several times throughout the last few presentations that I listened in on. Our human behavior and our decisions are directly tied to energy consumption. Our habits contribute directly to greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe Lisa said 40% comes down to behaviors. We produce waste and so on. So therefore, achieving the reductions that we need will require behavior change on a grand scale. The second point that I want to make is that behavior can change. It is not mysterious. We always talk about, oh, how do we do this? Well, we know a lot about behavior, and we have a lot of evidence that behavior can change. We've seen it in many other sectors in health, with smoking rates decreasing and seatbelt rates increasing. We know we can change behavior. And related to that, behavior is understandable, and social science can help. The study of individuals and groups can provide us insight into effective ways to promote change. More specifically, psychological research on pro-environmental behavior change dates back at least 40 years. And within that literature, there are a number of established findings that we can draw from in developing our programs. So very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the way behavior change efforts have typically been approached within the environmental sector. And that has taken one of two paths. First is a knowledge-based approach. And these are programs that are built on the idea that if people just knew what to do, they would do it. So we're assuming that people don't act because they don't know what to do. So we create public service announcements, and we hold workshops and print out lots and lots of flyers and conduct events, hoping that if we just could educate people, they will act. But what we know from the research is simply having knowledge about how to do something is not by itself motivation to take an action. And I think Lisa's tool is a really good example of going beyond knowledge and integrating other elements of behavior change. The second approach that we often see is more of an awareness-based approach. And these programs are based on an assumption that people don't act because they don't care enough. And so we produce messages that really highlight the severity of the problem. This is such a big problem. Nobody is acting. You should do something. And what we find is that simply having a positive attitude about something or being concerned about something doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. And I think we could probably all in this room and in this virtual room think of things that we know we should do and we know how to do them and we care about them, but maybe we don't engage in them, whether it's fitness goals or health goals or even our own personal environmental behavior goals. And there are many examples, I won't go into detail here, of campaigns that have taken this approach and spent great deals of money educating and getting really great results in terms of awareness. We've seen it on the statewide level with the California's Flex Your Power campaign, national programs around nutrition. Many people aware and they recognize the programs, but very little behavior change associated with that. And the reason for this is that unfortunately, what works for marketing to shift consumer preferences from Coke to Pepsi or McDonald's to Burger King does not always work when we're trying to engage an audience in behaviors that are often more difficult, more costly, or more convenient than the alternative. It is more convenient to drive by yourself to work than carpool or ride a bike, for example. So a lot of the behaviors we're trying to engage people in are new habits as well, and it's not a simple matter of shifting a consumer's preference. So community-based social marketing has emerged as an alternative to these information-intensive approaches. Called CBSM often, it combines traditional social marketing with knowledge from the social sciences and has been used to address a wide range of behaviors in the environmental domain. Community-based social marketing is not new. It's grounded in decades of social science, and it is an evidence-based process. It's not a simple tactic that you can bring into your program. The community-based social marketing at the core of it is that it's community-based, and what this means is that the programs are developed based on information gathered from the community. So in the case of Fort Collins, programs are based on knowledge about people in Fort Collins. And very often they're also delivered by the community. They leverage local community norms and local communicators. Community-based social marketing also emphasizes removing barriers, and those barriers are very often specific at the level of individual behaviors, and they can also vary based on an individual's context. So for the same behavior, different categories of individuals might experience different barriers. For some, it might be cost, for some, it might be inconvenience, and for some, it might be just general apathy. So community-based social marketing addresses these barriers for different groups. And then lastly, it's behavior-based. And by that, I mean that community-based social marketing focuses on behavioral outcomes rather than outputs. So we're less concerned about how many people came to our Facebook page and more concerned about how many people changed their behavior as a result of our program. So very quickly, community-based social marketing breaks down into 5 steps. We begin by selecting a behavior. And this is a very strategic selection, beginning with what is the desired outcome that we hope to achieve? Who are the sectors and audiences that are most closely associated with that outcome? So who's going to have the biggest impact? And then what are the behaviors that those audiences are engaged in that are most important or most closely tied to that outcome? Once we have made a selection about the behavior or behaviors we want to focus on, we then move on to conducting barrier and benefit research. And it's very important to understand the barriers, that is, what are the things that decrease the likelihood of participation, as well as the benefits. What are the things that enhance the likelihood of participation for each of the individual behaviors that we're interested in? So what might prevent somebody from replacing their light bulbs with LEDs is going to be very different than what might prevent them from composting their food waste or buying an electric vehicle. Even though they may be equally concerned about the environment and equally concerned about climate change and have an equal understanding, the barriers can be very different at the level of those individual actions. So in the 3rd step, then we develop strategy and only move to that step once we have a good understanding of barriers and benefits. Those strategies are then pilot tested on a small scale to ensure that they are effective and cost effective before rolling them out more broadly across the community. So in interest of time, I'm going to focus the rest of my presentation on that 3rd step, developing strategy, and how we go about doing that with a community-based social marketing lens. First, we focus first on enhancing motivation. If people don't have any motivation and there's no drive forward, then the barriers are irrelevant. They're not even going to hit the barriers because they're not interested in even starting. So we need to make sure first that the audience has sufficient levels of motivation. And then we move to addressing the barriers. And I'll show you some tools that we use to address barriers. And then lastly, we bring in tools from the social sciences. Some of those can be used to address barriers, and some are more appropriately focused on enhancing motivation. So two of the tools that we most often use for addressing barriers are convenience and prompts. Convenience, I believe Lindsay mentioned this in her presentation also. If you can make it easy for people to do, we enhance the likelihood that they will participate. So we very often focus on how do we make the desired behavior easier. What we less often see, though, is the reverse of that, and at the same time making the undesired behavior harder. So for example, we can make biking easier by offering bike lanes, priority crossing, and intersections. But if at the same time we're also making single occupant driving harder through, for example, parking fees or reduced lanes, this is also going to benefit us in terms of bringing about the desired behavior change. Another tool for removing barriers is prompts, and often people don't act because they forget. In these cases, prompts, which are visual or auditory reminders, can facilitate change. So this is as simple as a light switch sign, a text message. These things have been used effectively across a wide variety of domains, including in energy efficiency. Importantly, these are simple reminders rather than persuasive appeals. So they might be an element of an overall campaign to persuade and educate, but the prompt itself is simply meant to remind. It's best used for repetitive actions, things that people are doing repeatedly, and when they're placed close in space and time to where that behavior is going to occur. So in the example here, you'll see an example from some work we did with Urban Sustainability Directors Network, reminding people to switch their washing machine temperature to cold, because we knew they were washing some things in hot, but we wanted to remind them to wash their clothes in cold. And so this was a magnet that they could place right on their washing machine. Last two tools I think I can get through in 2 minutes for enhancing motivation. First is commitment, and second is social norms. And these are two of the most powerful tools we have in our toolbox for enhancing motivation. So commitments work to a process they work due to a process that Daryl Bem refers to as self-perception theory. So essentially, making a commitment alters the way you see yourself. And also, consistency is seen as an important character trait, and we like to be seen as consistent between our commitments and our actions, and also between our actions and our previous actions. Commitments are most effective then when the audience is motivated to act, but is not yet engaged in the action. Because in order for that self-perception to happen, those commitments need to be voluntary. We cannot coerce people to make a commitment or bribe them with incentives. They really rely on internalizing that commitment. Commitments, again, have been demonstrated across a wide range of behaviors. And through this research, we've identified some best practices, including commitments are most effective when they are written rather than made verbally, when they are made public rather than privately, and when they are durable or lasting. So posted in a kiosk, for example, at the entrance to an employer. Here's an example on the slide here of a commitment to turn off computers at the end of the day that was posted in an office setting. So the individuals would sign their commitment and then post it in a visible location. The last tool I want to talk about here is social norms. There are essentially two types of norms. They are the common and accepted behaviors within a group, and they can be either what other people do, which is a descriptive norm, or what other people approve of doing, an injunctive norm. And individuals tend to conform to this norm, even if it's only a perceived norm. If they believe other people are doing things or not doing things, we have a tendency to go with that flow. Importantly, people follow the norm even when it's the wrong direction or the wrong behavior. So this is a very powerful tool, and often one that we don't know influences our own behavior. We see these types of messages through testimonials, normative feedback. So if you've looked at your energy or water bill, you may see your energy compared to that of your neighbors. That's an effort to use social norms to influence behavior. What the research shows is that social norms can be very effective for audiences whose motivation is low. In fact, in energy efficiency, we see the largest effects with high energy users. So we know that these social norms can be influential above and beyond other kinds of motivations like money or environmental concern. Importantly, norms messages should highlight people doing the right thing And to the extent possible, use close reference groups, like comparing people to their neighborhoods or cities or peers rather than to an out group. And one way that social norms can be achieved is to combine it with the previous tools. So if we group individual commitments together, we can convey a social norm. A lot of people are doing this. A lot of people think this is important. So here's an example, again, from the Cold Water Wash campaign, where we use testimonials from individuals in the community who were washing their clothes in cold water, and reported survey results that over half of the neighbors were reporting doing the right thing. So we may believe that nobody else is doing it, and that influences our actions. So we wanted to bring that information into the forefront. Actually, everybody is doing the right thing, and you should too. And then lastly here, just an example of how you can combine tools. So this is one of my favorite examples of all the projects we've worked on, because we got kind of a 3-for-1. The primary research showed that people simply forgot to turn off their computer monitors. They didn't realize it was separate from their computer, and they were generally just needed to be reminded. So what we did here was combine a prompt. You might recognize this from earlier, where people signed a commitment and they placed it on the lower left-hand corner of their screen, which is where they would go to log off. So we have the prompt, a commitment, and if you could imagine these distributed throughout a workplace setting, in aggregate, we also had a social norm. So you can think, when you use the research first to drive your campaign decisions, you can really get creative in how to get the most use out of the behavior change tools. And in fact, with that program, we saw a slight increase in the proportion of people turning off their computers, but most people were already doing that to a great extent. We saw very significant increases from pre to post, or between the control group and treatment group, follow-up in the proportion of people turning off their computers. So very powerful, but yet very simple type of campaign. So community-based social marketing in a nutshell, 5 steps. At that pilot testing phase, we can circle back and refine our strategy if it's not working. So we're not implementing and implementing programs that are either not effective at changing behavior or not cost effective. This is something we can sort out in pilot testing. So it has that built-in feedback loop. Last slide here, just some additional resources that I'm happy to share if you wanted to contact me, or if Lisa, you're sharing these slides to direct you to more information on community-based social marketing and how it can help enhance your programs, either at the private level, city level, county level, and all the way up. So thank you very much for my 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much for doing that. That was awesome. Well done in the short that we have. So thank you everyone for coming. And there may be still some snacks left. Feel free to stay for, we'll be here for about a half an hour. If you'd like to stay and connect with others, we didn't get a chance to connect with each other too much with our packed agenda. But please feel free to take that time now if you'd like to stay a few minutes and chat. And yeah, thanks again. We'll send out a link to the recording and also information on all the speakers if you want to contact them for further follow-up.
Thank you, Lisa.